Good morning. I'm Ayin Beis, volume 3. We are middle of, or 2/3 of the way down, page 1253, Aleph Resh Nun Gimel, which you can find the pages, you can find all these PDF pages at ayinbeis.com. So now, we're middle of the Rebbe Rashab's, what he called Raya Muchachas al Zeh, an absolute proof or a very demonstrable and clear proof that the neshamas are higher than Torah from the concept of tshuva. And summing up, that though Torah does talk about tshuva, but still tshuva is higher than Torah, as we see from the Medrash, that Torah's answer and remedy to sin is bring a korban, a asham, and God's remedy is to do tshuva. And he explained, because the Torah is dealing with the structure and system, so it can deal with a shegeg, with an inadvertent sin, and there you bring a korban. Where the Eibishter Hashem is talking about a level that's even beyond that, even a deliberate sin, that tshuva has the power to address that. The fact that an asham is brought on a mazid. But he said that all karbanos always come together with tshuva. So the tshuva part turns a deliberate sin into the level of an inadvertent sin, and the korban part erases that. And then finally he explained, whereas a chatos deals with a different lower level of tshuva, so it doesn't have that power to do that, even though it also needs tshuva, like we explained. And then finally he said, and tshuva amitis, you actually more than that. You don't just erase deliberate sins, you transform them into merits. Nasim asdenius kezochius. And then, especially now, after the Beis Hamikdash doesn't exist, so the Rambam says, we only have tshuva. And nothing stands in the way of tshuva. And that's why God said, through tshuva you'll be atoned. So kol zeh rak mitzad mailus hanashamis mitzad atzmo she'em mushroshim ba'atzmus ein sof. All this is due to the fact that the souls, the quality of the souls on their own, they're rooted in the core of Ein Sof, higher than Torah. And that's why tshuva has this power, because tshuva also is reaching that place. But if neshamas were not there, the tshuva wouldn't help, because the tshuva cannot access. What would it access? You need to have the neshamas are there, and therefore with their tshuva they can access these higher levels that can even transform the most deliberate sins into zochis. Okay, we began the next section, but let me go over it again. So as we said, the quality of souls is not just in its root, but as he began to explain, it's also through ishtalshlus. That, for example, on top of page 1252, he said, and he said at the bottom of page 1251, I should say. So what did he say? The souls, not only in Atzilus, there he went backwards from Atzilus, Bina and Zah, Imi, the mother is higher than Zah Torah. As we said, Torah is involved in Nigla the Torah, in Chesed and Gvura and Zah Midas. But then he went back and said also in their root in Ak, that Torah is Chitzenius of Adam Kadmon and Mishamas are Primius, which rooted in Malchus of Ein Sof, and all the way higher, even before the Tzimtzum, rooted in Atzmus Ein Sof, like we're describing now. But now he's returning it back, just as it is in the higher levels. He says, I'm reading from the line that starts with Saratzma. Around 2/3 of the way down on page 1253, remember, we learned Torah is coming from Cochma, but we said Noivles Cochma Shalamayla Torah, the droppings of Cochma. How could you say that? It's because he explained that at the bottom of page 1251, because the Torah, as it comes down into Midas, which means as it's involved and engaged with the matters of this world, of determining what is right and what is wrong, what is kosher, what is not kosher, what is pure, impure, merit versus guilt. etc. That's the Torah as it comes down. And that's Nevel's Chochma, Nevel's Bavad, Legaba Atzmus HaChochma. Aval Neshama is B'Shoshnim B'Atzmus HaChochma Mailam HaTorah. 4 lines from the bottom of 1251. So now he's coming back to that now. So first we talked about it all the way in the highest levels. Now he says same thing in Sheresh Rabbi Chochma, B'chinas Primis Atzmus HaChochma. So it'd be like saying Torah is God's mind, Chochma, as it manifests as how he wants the blueprint for existence, how he wants the world to live, to be. Even though it's rooted in Shashrim Atzmim, we said, on the highest levels, it's God's internal pleasure, but it's still Shashrim, not Atzmim, not Tainug Atzmi. But what's the purpose of it all? Savas B'nai Yisrael, that the Torah should be a blueprint for the Jewish people, that they should know the neshamas what to do. So in the very Chochma that God has in Torah, there's the primis atzmis of it, which the neshamas are connected with. This doesn't mean Torah is not rooted there, but Torah propel in actuality manifests itself in the wisdom of learning and understanding God's will and God's plan. And the neshamas is the purpose of it all, the ones that fulfill the purpose. And like he says now, he brings, which is like from Tanya, kamoshel haben shuma atzmus moyachaav. The father has intelligence, just like and he could teach his intelligence to a student. But a child gets more than just the seichel. He gets atzmus moyachaav from the very genetic core, like he says in Tanya, from the very essence of the father. That's higher than the wisdom and the intelligence in the mind. And that's where we stop. So he's now going to explain this. So let's continue. And the inyan in this is, what does this mean that they get more than just the seichel? So the truth is, it's Perek Beis of Tanya. And you're going to quote the same Maimer Chazal. Dehina Yisrael Olu B'Machshoveh. It says that the Yisrael, the Neshamas Yisrael, Ola, they arose in the thought of God. V'yadua de Machshoveh b'chinas Cochma. So in general terms, even though machshav is usually considered a levush, a garment to seichel, but in general, when you say chachma, ola machshav, it's like saying ola b'seichel, ola b'chachma. Like he says tak in Tanya, when he says that the neshamas arose in machshav, he right away says machshavte v'chachmase yizbarach, because at times we use them together, because machshav is essentially the expression of chachma. Chachma is the faculty, machshav is its expression. So in general terms, we use them together, and he actually brings a proof from Zohar, where it says machshava v'yevla. Yevla literally means the jubilee, but it's referring to bina. Machshava and bina, lo yisparish la'alman. So you see, he's not saying chachma and bina, which sometimes it's referred to chachma and bina, trei rein lo yisparish, like two friends that can't be separated. But here he uses the word machshava. So he's just making a case that machshava and chachma sometimes are reversible, essentially synonymous. So pirush olah machshava hainu, what it means olah. So literally olah means that you're like sitting and suddenly something comes up, like we say, it arose in my mind. But what does that mean by Hashem? Hashem is not sitting and daydreaming and suddenly something arose. So he says, Olah means aliyah, from the word aliyah. Olah means from the highest part of his machshava, not just an external element, but Olah b'machshava. So even though the Tanit Ve'elyo we learned in the Medrash says, Shnei dvarim kadmu le'elam, two things preceded existence. Torah v'Yisrael, and then he said, and between them, which precedes which? So he said, Yisrael kadmu. So the same idea here, that even though Torah also comes from a very high level, like we spoke about, before you build the building, the architect or the visionary that builds the building has in his mind the intention. What's Olu B'Machshoveh? What's Olu B'Machshoveh? The home he wants to build for himself and his family or for his child. That precedes the building. The building is existence. Seder Shtalshus, God built their life. Boresh is Bar Elokim. Torah Yisrael precede the building because it's the purpose of creation. The purpose precedes the actual product. But within that proceeding itself, because the whole purpose of existence is to bring Torah, that the Yisrael, the Neshama, should live by Torah and transform the world into Adira B'Tachtein. So they proceed. The purpose precedes the product. And in the purpose itself, there's also two levels. Torah, which is rooted, obviously, higher than existence. But then there's Neshamas even higher, because the whole point of Torah is to give Neshamas the ability, the tools, to fulfill that purpose. So Yisrael Olu B'Machshoveh, the Pnimis Atzmus Moyech Ha'av, that means Olu B'Machshoveh, the Pchinas Elyena, the Machshoveh, which is the Pnimis Cochma Shalamayla Ma'atera, Shu Pchinas Nevlis Cochma, higher than Torah, which is only the droppings of Cochma as it relates to existence, of telling us what to do, what not to do. Now, does the Torah have a root in that higher place? Yes, but he's talking here Torah as a manifest. Now, we spoke about Neshamas will need Torah, and Torah needs Neshamas. But here he's focusing on what Mashpia, that Torah, that the Neshamas are being Mashpia into Torah because they are a higher level. And then he adds again, this is even on the lower level, the Chochma. Ube'emes, and in truth, Gam Lamayla Mebchinas Torah Shalamayla. Canal. And in truth, Neshamas precede Torah, not just where Torah comes into Zah in existence, and Neshamas are from Olu B'Machshoveh, from a deeper level of the mind, like this child from the deeper level of the mind of the father. But also how it is Lamayla, Neshamas are higher even as Torah is in its root above. He just repeats that just to give fill the whole picture in. And now the Rebbe Rashab is going to conclude with one more piece on this matter. But I'll stop here for a moment if anybody wants to ask anything. No? Okay.
Yes, I have a question. If the shamas are higher than Torah, rooted higher than Torah, how come there's a halacha that if a person has to choose to save the life of his Rebbe or his father, his biological father, because the halacha is that is to save the life of the Rebbe because he gave you Torah, he taught you Torah and brought you to Olam Haba. So my question to you would be, if neshamas are higher, you would think that you would have to save your fathers because that's where your neshama is mashurish in your father's moichim, his etzim. You would think you'd have to go for your father rather than Torah. There it seems to be that there's a level of Torah is higher than the neshama of the father.
Well, first of all, you're being a little too technical. First of all, both your father and your teacher and your Rebbe have a neshama. So the question is, so they both have neshamas besides the Torah that he taught you. The question is that which neshama takes precedence in your life. So you can argue that's not about, the Torah is just saying a matter of precedent regarding which neshama to save. That's number one.
Yes.
Number two, the mashal of the child and the father is only a mashal. The nimshal here is that the neshamas are rooted in Atzmus Ein Sof, which means both the teacher's neshama and the father's neshama are rooted in Atzmus Ein Sof. The fact that you come from your father, yes, you can ask a different question. Forget about the discussion, it has nothing to do with neshamas. Why should your biological father be second to your spiritual father, so to speak, to the person who taught you? The answer to that is because Torah has tremendous value. It's not just that you're a child, but that's a question independent of this whole discussion. Why does a teacher take precedence to a father? This does not address the issue of which neshamas are higher or Torah is higher. If you want to bring that into the picture, I would say pikuach nefesh decher kol haTorah kula, that the danger to life pushes aside Torah. That's also a proof that neshamas are higher. But I don't see that as relevant to whether you're. It's like in anything. There's an order of a hierarchy, an order of priority. Like the same thing with many other matters, which a Kohen Gadol comes first, or a Talmid Chacham comes first, or the Melech comes first. This is a completely different discussion, why each one has their level of hierarchy. But as far as from the Neshamas and Torah go, I don't see the contradiction here at all.
Even though the neshama, I hear what your point is. They both have neshama, so you're there. It's not a proof about neshama, but the fact that your father gave you life itself.
So that's a question independent of this mind.
Independent. It doesn't show you a little mile. Okay, because they're both neshamas. You're saving both. They're both neshamas. Okay, I understand it. Thank you.
Rabbi, I have a question. You said because neshamas are higher than Torah, neshamas Yisrael, therefore the neshamas are mashpia on Torah. Is that the same? Is that manifested by like achosi, or those two different concepts? And if so, what do you mean by
achosi is not mashpia. Achosi is using Torah and applying it. Biti is mashpia. That's what he said explicitly.
Not biti, imi.
Imi rather, yeah.
Imi.
Yeah, he didn't spell out what the mashpah is.
That's
detail.
My question. That was my next question.
He didn't finish the topic yet, so I would wait till he finished.
Okay. Thank you.
Ukiyadua, as it's not and as it's known, shekol sfira nivchan begimel madregas. So he's going to now bring into the picture just to add some more clarity. Every sphere, this is from the Pardes, Narmak, different places. Every one of the spheres is essentially a level, Cochma, Bina, Das, and so on. That every sphere is nivchan, is measured, and by three levels. What are they? Ha'echad, chelek ha'tachten, the lowest part of the sphere. Mashemashpia l'zulase, with that what it transmits to another. So let's say chesed. The lower level of chesed would be how chesed is giving kindness to another. The higher level, which we'll talk about is more, is how chesed is within you before. That's the first level. And this explains what we learned earlier, if you remember about nihi, back on page 1251. So he spoke about how that when Bina or Torah gets involved with Midas, it's the nihi of Ima that becomes the moichin of Zah, and that in turn manifests the Netzachayid of Chachma. So nihi, like every sphere has all the spheres within them. So you have the Chabad within Chabad, you have the Chagas within Chabad, and you have the nihi within Chabad. Same thing, every sphere, Chesed has Chesed Sheba Chesed, Vura Sheba Chesed. So generally speaking, the nihi is the lower three. It's not mentioning Malchus for different reasons. Malchus isn't always counted in this. But basically the nihi, the lowest three levels, or the next to lowest three of a sphere, indicate how that sphere is relating to the next, to that which is beneath it. So think of it like a vertical pillar. So the lowest of a higher level becomes the highest of the next level. Quite practical in that sense, but it's also that way spiritually. Habeis, what's the second measurement? What's the second level? Atzmis hasfira, the very sphere itself, not as it's transmitting to another level, not its lowest as it becomes the moichin of the next level, but the atzmis hasfira. And the third, you can imagine, hagimul, chelek ha'elyon, the top of the sphere. Mashadovuk be'ilose, that which is attached to its cause. So therefore, every sphere has, you can put it simply put, every sphere is like a student or a recipient of that which was higher. There's the very core entity of it, and then how it becomes a mashpia to the lower level. So think of a student and a teacher. That student really has three states. There's how he sits before his teacher, and then he's like a recipient to the lowest levels of the teacher. There's how he is on his own, and there's how he becomes a teacher to those beneath him or below him. Three levels of every sphere. Yeah, he says here explicitly. Like it says in the Pardes is the magnum opus of Rav Moshe Cordovero, acronym Ramak. Wherever you see Ramak, He was a contemporary, a little older than the Arizal, but a giant in Kabbalah. So Shar Gimel Perek Zayin, that's where he writes this. He breaks it like you see. A lot of Kabbalistic books are written in Sha'arim. Some places you call them Prokim, chapters or sections. But the Arizal and the Ramak and many call them Sha'arim, gates. Which is an interesting expression, the gates. So it's gate 3, chapter 7. Shom. What's Shom? Unless he means like a comma, Shom, that there it says, he didn't mention a Pardes before. Okay, most likely it's shame, not shame, no. It looks like he's saying, and there it says the following. The B'Chochma, now he's going to apply this to Chochma, as we were talking about in Shamis and Torah. The B'Chochma b'chinas alyena sheba. What's the higher level of Chochma? Hu be'erech shivya el hakeser. That's what it says in Pardes. It's commensurate to the level be'erech shivya. It's like it's almost equal to keser. When you say be'erech, you say it's like an estimate. But be'erech means be'erech shivya el hakeser. So the higher level of Chochma is comparable. I'm trying to find the exact translation. Probably almost measurable, equal to Keser. So that means Chochma, the highest level of Chochma, is close to Keser. Then there's going to be the middle of Chochma, which is the very core, and there's the lower part of Chochma. And delve into the Maimer Hemshech. The Cochma is one of the classic Hemshechim of the Rebbe Rashab's father, the Rebbe Marash, and was delivered in the year Tofresh Lamed Zayin, which is equivalent to 1877. That this level, he says there, V'kocha, the Maimer begins V'kocha. It's a Pesach. It begins Pesach. V'kocha techlu is a Pesach. So he says Shezeu b'chinas ma de Chochma. This level refers to ma. Remember, Chochma is made up of two words. Koyach ma, faculty of what? Ma is the higher level of Chochma. V'b'chinas ayin de Chochma, like ma means what? Ma always refers to a level of bittul. Like what? When you say what, it's like it's a wonder, it's a surprise. It's not containable. So this is called the ayin of Chochma. Shalei nitn lenas bei. This is not given for us to benefit from. You may remember where this expression is used very often. Well, every year when we bench Chanukah licht, what does it say? That we shouldn't have anah from it. What does it mean we shouldn't have benefit from it? Because there are levels that is meant to stand in awe of, instead of you feeling that it's there for you, it's more that you're being makabel from. So this level of Chochma is when Chochma feels in a state of awe, of receiving, in a state of bittul, of receiving. The antithesis to that is Bina. Bina is I understand, I'm understanding. There's value in that. But this level of Chochma, the higher level of Chochma, which looks to Keser and is almost equal to Keser, is a state of bittul, of suspension of self in the face of something greater than yourself. Ein lanu reshus lishtamish behem is the expression in Haner Salalu. It's a little different, but the idea. So it says this is a level shalei nitnu lenas bei v'sham, and there in V'kocha he also adds shezeu k'may b'chinas radla d'lo yisyada. That this ayin of Chachma is comparing to radla. Reisha d'lo yisyada is radla, the head that's unknown, the unknown head. Basically, the unknown mind. It's like the superconscious. Radla is usually either primius arich or even atik. The lo yisyada is beyond knowledge. It transcends knowledge, awareness. So we see from here that Cochma is the highest level of Cochma, is what connects to that which is higher. Remember, Torah is Cochma as it comes downward to help us define and learn and understand halachas, midas. I don't know if he's spelling that out here, but the fact that he said that Sphere has 3 levels, I think he's focusing on level 1, the recipient, but we can definitely imply from that Torah is either Atzmis Chachma or probably Chachma as it comes down to Midas, which is what he said on 2 pages back on 1251. But let's continue. He says, V'zehu Ayin Yisrael Olu B'Machshoveh. Again, Machshoveh and Chachma are synonymous here. And this is Olu B'Machshoveh means Olu B'B'chinas Elyena Sheba Chachma. So he's really explaining the word Olu. Remember we said Olu doesn't just mean it rose in God's mind, that it's B'chinas Elyena, and B'chinas Avaliyah in Chachma itself, in Machshavah itself, it's the higher level of Chachma, which means the higher of the 3 levels within the sphere of Chachma. So now we understand this which is attached to Keser, like he said on the top of the page, Raivin Tichol, Raivin Atik. So in other words, it's how the neshamas are attached to Keser. And again, by implication, Torah is not that level, it's lower level in Chachma. But now rises a question. I'm going to read till the end of the paragraph, then we'll stop for questions again. Didn't we say, he's going to ask now, didn't we say on page 1250, when he spoke about the Kalim of Atzilus, or is it 1 second, even earlier, 1 second here. Yeah, I think on 1250, let me just look. Megeres HaKedesh. Yeah, close to the end of the paragraph on 1250, he brought from Megeres HaKedesh that neshamas, that's what he was talking about, neshamas of being achim, like brothers, like siblings, not imi, but achim. So he said they're like me'ein b'chinas alikuz b'tzimtzum otzim u'ke'ein ha'kelim d'atzilus rak sheyotzu v'nifradu min ha'kelim. We spoke there that the neshamas are come out of the kelim of Atzilus, and he actually gave an example from Biri Azayar. Look at the last lines on page 1250, the last lines of the paragraph. So he gave an example, if you remember, that the kelim is how machshava atzmis, a core thought, where shecheshev davar hanegei atzmei, he's thinking about something that's negay to himself, and the shamas are like shecheshev davar hashayich alazulas, like thinking of something that's negay to another. In other words, the shamas saying davar b'fnei atzmei, and that's why the kav of Ein Sof is only is not melubish ben, does not manifest in them like in the kelim. So how is that consistent with what we just said now? That it comes from the atzmis of Chachma, the atzmis of Machshavah. That muscle seems to indicate it's about how you're thinking. God is thinking about that which is another, which is the neshamas going outward into this world or into lower worlds. And here he just said it's atzmis of Machshavah. So he's going to qualify. He says, Zomashin is barely ill. And he's referring to page 1250. The neshamas saying, Kamesha Chesha Bedavish Azulase. The example in the Biuri Azayar Pinchas on the pasuk of Yechida Sharishan I just read from, that it's like a muscle. They're like thinking about something that's zulase. You're just telling me it's not thinking about another. It's about the atzmis hamachshava in its core, looking up to Keser and connecting and attached to Keser. So he answers, he qualifies, he says, Zeu anashamas k'may shenimtzu b'chinas mitzias shenimtzu liyas davar b'fnei atzmei. What we're talking about, Shecheshev, is the part of God thinking of how these neshamas are going to become a mitzias, an existing entity, and a separate identity as they travel downward, like we say every day. Ata tahiri, neshama shenasata bi tahiri, ata varasa, ata yitzarta, ata nefachta bi, v'ata meshamra bi kirbi. So the neshama is going to come down, become a separate entity. Your neshama in your body, that's what he refers to there, because there God also intends that this neshama shouldn't remain in his core mind. He wants it to come down. That's the whole point of a neshama. Torah always remains and retains its kedusha, and even when it comes down, it's still Torah is always a holy sefer Torah that captures God's ratzon and wisdom. Where neshama does split off, it retains its divine nature, but it will become al separate. So that's what he means with the mashal. Avol sheirish makar neshamas, but the root and source of souls, hey b'chinas Olu B'Machshoveh, b'chinas primis ve'atzmas ein sof. They are in the level of Olu B'Machshoveh, which means in Machshoveh itself, the highest level al yena, in the core and essence of Ein Sof. Let me just explain what this means. I already explained it in previous classes, but just to reiterate it, because it can be a little confusing. Which one is it? Didn't God want the neshamas from the highest level to come down to this world? That's the point. So there's two parts to the neshama. One is the chelik elakam emal mamish, that it's actually, as best as we can say it in our language, a piece of God, a piece of godliness. As he explains in chapter 2 in Tanya. Like a child that's not just a student of God, but a child that has a very core essence of the divine. Now, obviously, you can't speak about the Eibishter in such a way. God doesn't have genes or DNA. But like he says in chapter 2 in Tanya, Vayipach, he infused and instilled in a human being something he did not instill in a tree or in a plant or in fish or in birds or in oil or in anything. All 6 days of creation, nowhere do you find that expression by Yipach Ba'apa. It says, Vayemer Elokim Yehi Oyer. So for sure there's divine energy in everything. But it's like the difference between speech. When you speak, you're investing energy in your words, Yehi Oyer, Yehi Rakia. But when you breathe from the deepest part of you, Vayipach, you blow. Literally. You have to, like he says, Metechi Yusei, Umeprimi Yusei, says in Tanya. Think of inhaling deeply, and then with the most powerful way, you blow, you exhale. God's breath. So it says Vayipach. It doesn't just say he spoke and said there should be a human being. So the Vayipach indicates that he instilled in the neshama something that nothing else has, which is a deeper part of the dimension. And the explanation is very straightforward. The rest of existence is the building. And the neshama is the God's child. That's the person he wants to send, his ambassador, with that divine element. So if you think about it, there are two parts to this. One is its divine nature and identity, and that is Olu B'Machshoveh, in the deepest parts, higher than Torah. And then there's the part where he has to tell the neshama as well, in God's mind is also that you need to now go downward all the way into this world and separate so-called from me, like the king sending the child away from his palace. So he retains, he's still the child, and he's still the Etzem Elikus, but he now has another dimension that he could act independently, which is, of course, the whole purpose of existence. And indeed, though he doesn't say it here, in some places it says, the mere fact that it comes from such an atzmizdik place, that's why a neshama could come down like no one else. A malach can't do that. A malach coming down to this world, the world will overwhelm the malach. Even Torah that comes down, but it retains its Torah nature. Torah does not manifest inside of a body in the sense where it's concealed and has to deal with an animal soul. Torah always remains godly Torah. We can ignore it, God forbid. We cannot follow it. But the Torah itself always retains its kedusha and never becomes something that has to go to war with anyone. Obviously, there are people who fight Torah, but I'm saying Torah itself never goes into a guf and nefesh abamis. Whereas the neshama, because it's rooted in such a deep place, that's why it can come down and has a fighting chance to deal with all the adversity of this world and actually transform it, that the neshama has that power. So really, it's two parts of the neshama. If you're talking about the very godliness of it, that is in the deepest levels. If you're talking about its role as it relates, the neshama will come down to this world to change the world. That's how God thinks about azulas. Not that the neshama is, but the neshama is going to go into a world that's outside of so-called the inner sanctum of the divine essence. So that's the nekuda. It's like when Moshe was on the mountain, and the malachim said to Hashem, "Tnei heitkol shamayim, why are you giving your glory, your chem de gnuza, your hidden treasure? Why are you giving to inferior human beings? Give it to us, the malachim in heaven. It's a spiritual entity. The Torah is spiritual. Humans will just are inferior. And Hashem says to Moshe, answer them. And it says Moshe was hesitant. He was like tentative. So Hashem said, hold on to my throne and answer them. And Moshe did. He opened up the Torah and said, what does it say in the Torah? It says, I am your God that took you out of Egypt. He said to the Malachim, were you ever in Egypt? It says, honor your parents. Do you have parents? It says, don't murder, don't steal. Do you ever have a temptation to murder or steal? So he brought proof from the Torah that the Torah is not for them. It's for us, people who have all these challenges. We are Mitzrayim, we have parents, etc., etc. So Chassidus, of course, the deeper meaning of that is that he was revealing to them that the Torah itself is telling you that it's not for heavenly spiritual levels, it's down below. But it's an neshama that the Torah is given to, Leiba Shamayim, not in heaven, that an neshama coming to earth can use the Torah to transform the world. And we discussed already, the value of Torah is that it actually gives us God's blueprint, God's intentions. We need to have an operator's manual. A neshama doesn't have an operator's manual on its own, even though it's a divine agent and a piece of the divine, but it still needs guidance in this dark world. And it needs Torah to reveal the achdus with Hashem, giluyim, like we learned. But on the other hand, the neshama has both a core essence higher than Torah and higher than everything. And on the other hand, the neshama comes down and has the power to deal with things in this world. And that is how he reconciles these two aspects of neshama, depending which part you're talking about. Neshama clearly has both ends of the spectrum, so to speak. Okay. So we conclude the chapter, the paragraph at the end of page 1253, 2 lines from the bottom. Any questions?
I have a question. I understand the answer that the Rabbi just gave, which you just explained, about, he says, so I understand everything you just said, but I guess I don't understand the question. What is it about that would come to bring into question whether neshamas are higher than Torah? I guess I just didn't understand how it was. He was raising a koshi, a difficulty on the point.
I thought I explained it, but I'll just repeat it briefly, because the question is, you just said it comes from atzmis hamachshaveh, and earlier you said it's about machshaveh as it's thinking about another, which would seem to indicate it's coming from a lower level of machshaveh that is already relating to the next level, like the spheres. It's not the highest level that's looking at keser. It's Cochma as it's looking to another, to azulas.
Whereas Torah is clearly looking above.
No, we're not talking about Torah. We're talking about neshamas now.
Well, but the question was,
the question is not about Torah. The question is about, you're saying that neshamas come from the highest level of Chachma, the core, when earlier you said that it's machshava that's thinking about another, which would suggest it comes from a lower level.
Okay, thank you for explaining the question.
Okay. Any other questions? Anybody wants to clarify? So now we'll continue. Now he's going to say, now he's bringing us all back, you know where? All the way back to, let's see here. Yeah. So we've now discussed the 3 levels of biti, achesi, and imi, with imi being the level of neshamas higher than Torah, the mashpia and Torah, achesi equal with Torah, and the capacity to apply Torah to life, and biti as a makabel, a student of Torah, like we said, a student of makabel of Zoh. But all that came to explain, if you remember, on page 1249, that Ava b'chol ma'idecha, which all the way leads us up to the level of Bina, and then Bina and Chachma gazing above. We're talking about a love that is beyond Seichel, and the Midas lead us there, and in turn, you have the deepest levels of Moichin, Gadlus HaAbba, manifesting in Zah, in Midas, and in Malchus. So now he's going to tie it all together with what we spoke about, B'chol Ma'idecha, which is, of course, the level of, we talked the high level of Bina, and B'chol Ma'idecha itself, there's 2 levels, but the higher level. So now he comes back. Fine, you've just explained the shamas are higher than Teda. Bina is higher than Zah, correct. But the fact is, however, the shamas do come down below. And when they come down below, they are involved in this world. And they could be even on the level of Biti, of daughter, which is a level, it's a high level. Malchus elevating to be a recipient. And Acheshi and so on. But how do you access this highest level of the neshama? Yes, the neshama now has it. We know it's high. It's rooted in higher than Teda, even in Cochma and Atzmis Cochma. But how do you access it? So he says, Lagia, to be able to reach this l'sheira shemakar neshama, we need Aveda. Who are the Aveda b'mesiras nefesh dafka. To access it and to reveal it, to draw it down, it's dafka Aveda mesiras nefesh, not regular Aveda, mesiras nefesh. The inyan mesiras nefesh or mesiras harotzen. So mesiras nefesh, most understand it as being people who gave their lives and would not, before they would bow to an idol, they gave their lives for God. But mesiras nefesh has a deeper meaning. There's mesiras nefesh even when there's no Nazis or idol worshippers. Mesiras nefesh sometimes it's called rotzen, and it's giving your rotzen. It's completely offering your desire to God. Ukiyadur the nefesh urotzen. Ukameshikosav ein nafshi. There's a pasuk that says ein nafshi, and it means there ein ritzeni. So we see from this that nefesh and rotzen, nefesh means rotzen. So yes, there's mesiras nefesh when a person actually gives their life, literally dies, kiddush Hashem, to sanctify God's name. But there's also mesiras harotzen, where a person is as if they're giving their entire life. They're not living a life of their own, but they're completely committed to godliness. Remember, we learned before, ava that reaches where it's negeya benefesh mamish. So when a person dies for it, it's very clear that's negeya benefesh. So they're ready to forgo their own lives, not to betray God, not to in any way worship another God or anything, or other challenges like that. But when a person remains alive, how do you know? What's the indication that they're completely ready to give their life? It means you see that their whole life is committed to God, not to themselves. I will soon discuss why you need this to be able to reach the Etzem HaNeshama. I think the reason is quite obvious. Because if you don't go to this level, then you can reach levels of godliness, but not the highest levels. Next page, 1154. Umesiras nefesh, umesiras harotzen. And therefore, mesiras nefesh, since nefesh means rotzen, is the giving away, completely committing your will. Liyez bebchinas rotzen echad laHashem levad. That it should become one desire, one will, only directed to God, no other wills. There's no desire for anything else. Completely God-centric, everything. And he says, "V'hainu," and this means ha'aveda b'bchinas primius harotzen shebenefesh. This is the aveda in the primius harotzen, the inner dimension of a person's rotzen, not just chitzenius harotzen. Yeah, he said that a few times. Primius harotzen mamish. U'kamoshin is barliel, as was explained earlier. And what does this mean? Exactly what I just said. He says, "Shezeu kasher alakus negeiloi b'pnimius nafshi." This is a state when godliness is negayed to him in the inner core of his soul, not just as he's committed to it and dedicated. And it's interesting, and but it's negayed to b'pnimius nafshi. Can't live without it. The oz is seirus nafshi b'chinas primius ha'atzmius. That's when the nefesh gets awakened and stimulated in a state of primius ha'atzmius. Just to use a human example, you can love something, but you know what? You can also live without it at times. Or the love is not completely through and through. You can also do other things. Here we're talking about the love is so all-consuming that it's primius nafshe, primius ha'atzmius, V'hu b'chinas Yechida shebenefesh. Okay, he spells it out now clearly. Yechida, the fifth level. This is Yechida shebenefesh, not nefesh, ruach, neshama, chaya, which correspond. Interestingly, he didn't say it, but I was thinking about it now that he says Yechida. So if you remember, b'chol levavcha, you can say is nefesh, and nefesh, b'chol levavcha, b'chol nafsha, b'chol ma'idecha. So if you remember, he said that there's two levels in b'chol ma'idecha. So you could say that's chaya and Yechida. We're talking about the highest level. And nefesh, ruach, and neshama is b'chol levavcha, b'chol nafshecha. B'chol nafshecha, all of your nefesh. So you have the nefesh, as he said, all of your b'chol levavcha, all of your heart, b'chol nefesh, all the keiches nefesh. So that would cover naran, and then chay and yechida would be the lower level of b'chol meidech and the higher level. He doesn't say it explicitly, but he definitely now says that the highest level is yechida, which corresponds to the fifth level he talked about earlier, chamishis, the deepest level of tshuva. The pirish ve'inyan yechidohi. What is the meaning and the idea of Yechida? Yechida means oneness. Yechida leyachdecha, we say Shmini Atzeres. It's one, complete oneness. All the other levels, Chaya means life, Neshama is a soul, Ruach is spirit, Nefesh is also another word for life. So he says Yechida shebechinas rotzen echad levad. Yechida means oneness, total singularity. It's one rotzen levad, the ein le shum rotzen zar klal, and does not have any other strange desire. Everything is one rotzen to Hashem. And he explains v'hainu, and this means kasher. When the stimulation or the awakening or the arousal is in the pnimius, in the inner core of his desire, how is a tefis called etzema nefesh? This grasps, this contains, this encompasses the entire core soul. In Yiddish, he says, to emphasize, whenever there's Yiddish, it means the Hebrew words are inadequate. He's trying to really drive the point home. Das nimmt darum dem ganzen etzem. That means it's not a part of you. The nimmt darum means embraces the entire core and essence of the person. As we see, all-consuming love. Unfortunately, we find more examples of this in not positive things, and not necessarily holy things. But you could imagine from the negative that there's that concept. Like when the Alter Rebbe was in prison, and they sent the different people to diagnose him, so to speak. So one of the diagnoses they said that he has, the psychiatrist said he has a very, very deep passion of love in him. And they identified a love to leadership, Malchus. And he explained to them that this was his deep love to Malchus of Ein Sof, or Malchus of Atzilus. So in other words, most of us identify deep passion for things that are not necessarily godly. But from that you can extrapolate, you can apply that imagine someone who's able to have that type of love toward God. So even though we may not be on that level, we can at least imagine it. So he says, it's nemtarum dem ganzem etzem, liyes yedua, being that it's known, he's making the case for all of this. Shaharotzen hu atiyas hanefesh v'amshachase. Because desire is not just an external, superficial component. It's hatiyas hanefesh. It draws the very soul of a person toward a certain inclination. When you desire something, all of you is drawn to it. V'hamshachase. Shatiya means like an inclination or drawn. Amshachase is even more than amshachase is like compelled by it. Le'eza davar, to any matter, whatever that Ratzon wants. So Ratzon has that element of drawing all of you. It's like, so let's say somebody shares something with you and you say, interesting, fine. But if you don't have a Ratzon for it and a Ratzon pnimi, you're not going to be drawn to it. Here he's talking that the Ratzon is atiyas hanefesh amshachase le'eza davar. And that's the level that we're talking about, the Mesidus Nefesh, that will allow the neshama to access its etzem and sherish in Atzmus Ein Sof. But what's the contrast to Pnimius HaRatzon? Is Chitzenius HaRatzon. The Chitzenius HaRatzon hu atiyas hanefesh haynu rak hachitzenius sheba'atzmus. The outer dimension of Ratzon, let's say you desire something, but it's not touching your very core of your essence. So you're also drawn to it. So the drawing of the nefesh, but it's to the chitzenius of the atzmus, like we learned earlier. It's the outer dimension of his core. Remember, it's atzmus because it's Ratzon. Once you have Ratzon, you're drawing your soul to it. But it's not something that you could say is touching through, is affecting him through and on the highest levels. We learned this earlier, more at length. Aval primis atzmus haratzon hu shetefes kol ha'atzmus. So the chitzenius of atzmus means, yes, part of your very essence is drawn to it. But if you want the whole person to be completely consumed, that requires primius atzmus haratzon. And he says, I am ashakosa bedrush yom tov sharash hashanah reish samach vov be'inyan ratzon ve'eneg. Yeah, in the Maimer Vayechulu there. So there in Samach Vov, he talks about the difference between ratzon and eneg. Where ratzon is something you are drawn to, eneg is where there's a deep pleasure, and talks about which is higher than which. And he addresses this whole issue of chitzenius and primius. The inyan ha'atiyah, and this inclination or this being drawn to, who azozes ha'atzmius, it's that it's shaking up. Hazaza means movement, but it means more. It means like your whole being, the very core of the person, is like being moved and shaken. Shekola etzem nizres bezeh, his entire core is moved by it. So it's not just affecting the person. It's hazaza is a very strong word. Hazaza, that there's real movement. You really get out of your comfort zone. You're really shifted to another state. I remember many times by Fabrengen that Rebbe would speak very passionately about something. And then he would use sometimes the expression, "Lei poga v'lei noga." It didn't touch and it didn't affect anybody. And then he sometimes would use the word hazaza. You don't feel hazaza. You don't feel there's been movement. You know, sometimes you can talk to someone, you're very passionate, excited, but you don't feel that you've moved them. They remain pretty much, at the moment they may get excited, but they remain in their comfort zone. They don't really shift. And you really, sometimes something shakes you so much that you're going to make sure that there's going to be movement, and you're going to get out of your status quo and move to a different, and azosas hanefesh, like he says here. V'hainu shebechol atzmusei hu la'Hashem levad, and that means that his entire core is only directed to God. Ve'ein mokum klal l'shum rotzon zar klal. And there's no room at all to any other. Zar means strange, but means any other desire at all. It says the word klal twice. Ein mokum klal l'shum rotzon zar klal. V'zehu b'chinis yechida shebeneshama. So if you want a definition of yechida, there you have it. This is yechida shebeneshama, when a person is in this state of all-consuming connection, love to God, that entirely encompasses the entire person without any room for anything else. And that's really, the word for it is obsession. But obsession is often associated with negative things. This is an obsession for God that does not leave room for everything. Obsession that you cannot live without it, and you move, and there's a real hazaza. It affects you in every possible way. I know, we wish we were on that level, right? And this in turn, what does this do? Just as it touched you at the core, so it's cause and effect, it also reaches and draws, it awakens and draws inner core of Ein Sof, Lias Gili Chadash. Remember Chadash? That there should be a new revelation, Mamish b'bchinas Cochma Bina. Something completely new in Cochma Bina that they did not have on their own. This is the B'chol Ma'idecha, the midas that leave Cochma Bina to Arich and Atik and all the upward. V'bchinas Yichud Pnimi the Abba ve'Ima. Remember that? The Yichud Shalom, the Zivug Shlim, the inner unification of Chachma and Bina, Shuzeu Hamshachas Er Chadash Kanal. That draws a new energy that was not there before. Chachma and Bina did not have that. And I'll read one more line. V'hu Dafke, and this is specifically Aideh Vedus HaNeshama, through the work of the Neshama, Mitzad Etzem Sharsha U'Makere Ha'atzmi. that's coming from its core, root, and source, in the core of Ein Sof. So here he's connecting and connecting all the ideas we learned back to what we learned earlier about this highest level of mutva, murgish, and muskal, even higher than muskal, where the mind is really connecting to things that are completely beyond. The midas lead that, and in turn the mind is feeding the midas and malchus, and its own one lovely integration, fusion of a seamless absorption and obsession with God. Yeah. I'm going to stop here. Then the rest of it, he's going to go back to Biti Achesi Imi and just tie it up. And then you see, just a few lines from now, you'll see Apiana, Kolana, Yuvana Hefesh Ben Gan Eden. He's going to talk about Gan Eden, the levels of Gan Eden based on all this. So he's going back now. We're going to go back literally 35 pages. But we're not there yet. We need a few more lines. So I'm going to stop here before the end of the paragraph because it needs more explanation. We're on page 1254. Any questions, my friends?
Yeah, I have a question. On the previous page, where the Rabbi says there that Yisrael Olu B'Machshoveh, the Bechinas Elyonish B'Chochma Hanusha B'Dbuka B'Keser. And then a few lines earlier, it says it's a level that's Sham the B'Chochma Bechinas Elyona Shaba Hu Be'erech Shave Halakeser. So it would seem to me, from what I'm learning there, that the Rebbe is talking about a level of the Shorish of Neshama of Yisrael is in the highest level, Elyona B'Chochma. But I thought we learned a couple of days ago that that our neshama is really mashurash in atzmitz itself, rather than what Torah was or Ein Sof or etzem or rather than atzmitz itself. It seems like here it's saying that our neshama is rooted in the highest level of a chachma, whereas we really are much higher than that. I don't understand that.
There's a whole seder shtalshlus. In
So
Seder Shtalshlus, this is constantly microcosm, macrocosm.
Oh, got you. Okay, so when he says shorish here, doesn't mean the
different
ultimate.
levels. It depends what level you're talking. He begins in Atzilus, and then he goes. He says, and the same thing is in its root, and higher and higher.
Okay, so it's just
Cochma Tamar goes all the way up
level.
to it approaches Atik. We learned that. I think that's right.
You should be thankful to him that he's saying that, because then that gives us some hope to connect, because the Sheirish Shemokar up there is going to be a lot harder. It's a lot easier to connect to the Etzem HaChochma than to connect to Etzem Atzmus before the Tzimtzum. So this is vital for our avodah that we have levels of this throughout the Shtalshlus, right? In this world as well. That we have that within us and with capacity to reach. It's climbing the ladder. And as you climb, everything climbs, you know.
So when he says the shorish is an Allah Makshava,
you have to read all the lines. You can't just choose one line. If you read before that, he'll say, if you go to the bottom of page 1251, he'll say that it's not just it says they're higher. He constantly talking. He talked at least 3 levels. He talked about Atzilus, Ak, and before the Tzimtzum. So these are the connecting lines are critical here. He's putting it in context. You can't just jump on one line. You have to look at the flow, how he went from the higher level, then he says the same things on lower levels.
I see. So here at this level, he's not talking about the ultimate high level.
Yes, he is. He just said Pnimius Atzmus Ein Sof. Atzmus Ein Sof. He did.
Right.
He's talking about all the levels.
All the levels.
Whatever level you want to talk about, he's addressing. I mean, what line are you referring to?
No, I see that. I saw that Atzmus Ein Sof. That's what. That's what. You
know, why you have to go back to the bottom of 1251 when he began. So as he built the case in each particular level, Okay, so we're stopping here by the middle of page 1254.